when using monoglycerides effectively or monoglyceride technologies effectively, they can add a lot to a system, whether it's 1% wean to finish mortality or more. It's still very large returns. So the correct placement is very important, but I think we need to look for monoglycerides. They have been lumped into the feed mitigation area or the feed biosecurity area. And I think the first thing I would ask people to take home is what we do in the first 48 hours. The second thing is that these monoglycerides do an awful lot for the immune system. And what they do for the immune system is very, very powerful tool if we use it correctly.
Hello and welcome to the Swine podcast. I'm Dr. Tara Donovan, your host today. And today I have my guest, Dr. Fredrik Sandberg. Dr. Sandberg is a senior research and development nutritionist with the First McNest Company. Welcome to our show, Dr. Sandberg.
Thank you, Dr. Donovan. Appreciate to be here.
So, Dr. Sandberg, I want you to just describe to us a little bit about your history, where you got to where you are today and your career path.
Okay. So I am not American, which probably people can hear by my accent, but I'm actually Swedish, and I came through the training, schooling, university system in Scotland, where I did a degree and a PhD in swine, and then in computer modeling of swine nutrition and health. And that took me to the US, and in the US I got focused to baby piglet nutrition, and that led me into disease and health. And from there on, including my PhD, I've really have been focused fully on how nutrition and health interacts, and that's really my focus / obsession. So.
Well, that's great. As a veterinarian, I'm really excited to learn a little bit from you today. So my understanding is that you've done some work on monoglycerides and their role in immunity. So first, let's start off with just a basics about monoglycerides for those of us like me who aren't a nutritionist with background.
Sure. So fatty acids have been well known since ancient times. People have been using coconut oil, olive oil for many centuries for their natural health benefits. And people started identifying which particular chemical compounds were active, either antibacterial or antiviral, and those were typically organic acids. So, for example, coconut oil is about 45 to 50% lauric acid, which is a very active compound. But then over time and through the development of the process of esterification, they've been able to create monoglycerides, which is basically a fatty acid bound to a glycerol molecule.
Okay, so that makes sense.
A worldwide leader in animal nutrition, Adiceo's portfolio of products includes methionine, the full range of vitamins, enzymes, organic selenium, probiotics, mycotoxin management strategies, and palatability products. With such a diverse offering, Adiceo supports its customers with a broad range of expertise, tools, and services to help them maintain a competitive advantage. Adiceo, fueling predictable profits. To learn more, visit Adiceo at www.adiceo.com.
So you mentioned lauric acid, so there's a lot of different kinds of them. What distinguishes one from another? Just the chemical composition?
Sure. So we have everything from short chain carbon lengths of maybe C2, C3, C4, such as acetic acid, propionic acid, butyric acid. And when they are bound to a glycerol molecule, you get monopropionine, monobutyrene, or monoacetyl. All the way up to the longest ones, like C12, carbon chain 12, would be monolaurin or lauric acid, and going all the way up to palmitic acid and even longer lengths than that. So it's the length of the carbon skeleton that decides what type of monoglyceride we're dealing with.
And so for some of the products that we use in pigs, we use products that are kind of a combination of both short and medium or long chain fatty acids. Is that right? Is there a reason for that? the combination?
Yeah, so it's really the heart of the matter is that some of these have been very well characterized. Like, for example, monolaurin, I speak about that as a primary one because it's so well studied and has been studied from sow's milk or from breast milk and has been developed and been used. Lauric acid has been part of infant formulas for a very long time because it's a critical nutrient. But as we then have more choice, and especially economically available monoglycerides versus ones that are too expensive to use in livestock, we're faced with a question of how do we use these different ones in combination, because they all have very, very different impacts on bacteria and viruses, but they also have very, very different impacts on the physiology of the animal, like the gut membranes, but also they stimulate the immune system in very different ways, which can make it a little bit of a thorny rose to use. So
that makes sense. I appreciate that description. That helps me. So you mentioned just a minute ago about immunity and their role in immunity. So they have different effects. Let's segue into that area that you've done quite a lot of work on.
Sure.
So just start with the basics of monoglycerides and immunity and how they work with the gut of the pig.
Yeah, so the immune system is obviously very, very complex. And we have two sides of the immune system, the innate and the adaptive immunity. And they have very unique nutritional requirements. For example, macrophages or T cells use very specific nutrients. And a lot of work, I think the best example that I can give, which most people know about, is the relationship between omega-6 fatty acids and omega-3 fatty acids. A lot of people will know that the ratio of those, or for example, the ratio of fish oil to corn oil, can have vast threefold, fivefold impacts on inflammation. And what we're seeing more and more is that the immune system has a very selective nutrient requirement at different times of the infectious process. And this is the area that we have done a lot of work in, and we've gotten enough scars along the way to know that there's a lot of great care has to be done, both in terms of when you use these products and how you use them in combination.
Right, exactly. So let's talk about the little pig and the that time when we're weaning the pig from the sow to the nursery. That's an area that I know there's a lot of stress going on, right? And there's a huge change in the diet of the pig, and so it's important that at that point to add some products that may have some additional monoglycerides in them or fatty acids. So let's talk about the immunity of that pig, that critical time.
Yeah, so obviously in the baby pig, we have really two main issues. We have a very naive immunity, very low level of natural immunity, and we have a pig that has a very poorly developed gut. So, for example, monobutyrin is a very elegant technology for developing the enterocytes, for developing the small intestine to really be good at absorbing nutrients. Where some of the other monoglycerides, caprylic acid, capric acid, and their monoglyceride forms can be very effective against, for example, E. coli and Salmonella. And then if we start thinking about some of the more gram-positive bacteria like Clostridia or Streptococcus, we're looking at some of the more longer chain, for example, monolaurin or palmitic acid and those kind of materials.
Fredrik, have you done some work with feeding the sow and in terms of, perhaps a herd has a specific disease challenge that they're dealing with, and then feeding the sow that then in turn can provide some additional benefit to the nursing piglet? Have you done work in that area?
And there's quite a lot of research in this area, specifically in Europe. Amoxicillin is not an option. And unfortunately, strep is an issue that the global pig population deals with. And strep, especially severe cases of strep, if you start in the nursery, it's too late. And feeding some of these monoglycerides in the lactation diet can be extremely beneficial, both for the increased immunity, but some of these monoglycerides supporting those piglets and reducing the pathogen load that they carry into the nursery. And it's been, we've seen some very large success with it, very, very large. But sometimes doing it only in the nursery on its own was not enough. And that's typically for the stronger level of challenges.
Right. So, kind of programming that gut right for the pig, getting protection from the mother, and then perhaps helping more setting the gut up for the challenge instead of, retroactively trying to cure it. Yeah, absolutely. So what about, you mentioned timing of products like this. So in the nursery, there's, a lot of challenges going on with the pig. How long before the challenge would you recommend some kind of a targeted process to make sure that gut is healthy for that specific challenge?
Sure. I think in terms of a program approach, it's really starting in lactation, ideally, because it does do some both immune priming effects, but it also does some impacts on the overall pathogen load that pig carries into the nursery. But then the reality is that we have a phase that John Plusky in Australia has done probably more research on than anyone else, which is the first 7 days post-weaning. And those first 7 days post-weaning can really dictate the lifetime success of that pig. And what we have found is that it is very, very hard to get. If we talk about, for example, like we think about antibiotics having milligrams per pound of body weight that we need to achieve, a lot of the time it is impossible to get to the level that we need to support that animal through feed. And that's where we spent as a company an awful long time developing technologies to deliver monoglycerides through the drinking water to try and bridge those first 3 to 5 days. And then as the feed intakes start ramping up in the first week on the starter feeds, they can build it up. But the answer to your question is we have the classical problem of mid-nursery to late nursery challenges. And typically they can be E. coli, it can be strep, it can be many things. But let's say, for example, E. coli in late nursery, that is typically caused in the very first 5 days of that pig's weaning period. And that's why we have found that the earlier the better is a simple rule. But it's really trying to look at approaching through the drinking water because those first 3 days they eat so little.
Right. So if you're going to do a programmed approach, as you mentioned, how many days would you be looking at treating that pig through the water to get that gut healthy?
Yeah, so we typically try and do 3 to 7 days. Typically 5 is the standard approach because by day 5, the pig is usually eating about 0.3 to 0.4 pounds per day. And that's enough to get high enough dosage from the feed, and then carrying on that program for at least the first 21 days. Ideally, if depending on your feed budgets, if you can get into maybe past that 30-day mark, because there's so much that happens in between day 21 and 28 in terms of immunity, it's helpful. But a lot of people, their feed budgets don't allow that, and you kind of have to force it to be the first 3 weeks, because if you do it throughout the whole nursery, it may get expensive.
Right. One thing that I've noted is that during a transition, we have had some increased E. coli challenges. And so, a transition, like you mentioned, mid-nursery. So is it that the intestines weren't, or the gut wasn't set up for that transition, or is that transition just too harsh? What's your thought?
Sure. I've spent the last 15 years of my career studying this, so I want to try and not go off on a tangent. The reality is E. coli is always there. It's whether it's angry or not. And I think we do an awful lot of things good in terms of starter pig nutrition, but we can also do some silly things like escalating soybean meal too fast. We can remove it's always easier to have 3 phases instead of 4, but every single step has a larger change and transition. Um, and ultimately, the largest immune organ that we have in our bodies, including us as people, is our gastrointestinal system. And it's full of the toll-like receptors that are remarkably strong at impacting our overall system. So the biggest way, in my view, is preventing adhesion, which is going to be to ensure that we don't have erosion of the mucosal layer, which is very important for preventing them from sticking to the gut. But the other thing is to keep other commensal bacteria and even natural bacteriophages in check, because we don't know all the reasons why E. coli gets so angry at times, and at other times you can have literally a 4,000 head nursery and you have the 2,000 head barn on this side that is 2% nursery mortality, and on the other one you have 10%, even though you had excellent management and hitting it with tremendous amounts of strong antibiotics. It is very central to begin from the very immediate point those pigs are weaned. And if people take anything home from this talk, is that what happens in even the first 48 hours is remarkably critical.
Right, and I have seen the same thing that you mentioned, is everything managed well and everything right, and things can still not work, right? So you mentioned that first 48 hours. I've done some work or seen firsthand the impact of wean age on kind of that gut health, and so give me your view on that and how that might interact with, for that first 48 hours and the right nutrition there as well.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. We work with a lot of different systems across the US that have everything from, I would say, 18 days would probably be the youngest, up to 28 days in some of the antibiotic-free systems that we work with. And it is a remarkably different pig. And I think the benefits, I did an analysis of a system that had nearly a decade worth of MetaPharm's records, and they in their system prioritized weaning weight, and they obviously had to increase their weaning age to do so. And we found a very powerful break point around 16 pounds body weight, 16 to 16 and a half pounds. And once you were able to get to that level of weaning weight, the wean to finish performance was dramatically improved. And really both gain and feed efficiency. So I think it is very, very important, especially because that weaning weight is an average, and we have 1,000 animals. And I think that's a key part of it, is that bottom 30%. But I think there's also something about how they can work through the first 7 days, minimize the growth gap or the drop off in performance, and to bounce back. And I would never believe it if I hadn't seen some of John Plotsky's research. But even from doing creep feeding, picking up 6 to 7 kilos or 12 to 14 pounds wean to finish from reducing the drop off in growth rate post weaning.
Right. And that's interesting you mentioned creep feeding, because kind of back to that E. coli strategies, dealing with some E. coli in the field, that was one of the topics that we talked, or one of the mitigation steps that we wanted to look at, is can we creep feed and help that the impact of, or the prevalence of E. coli that we had. So how does that creep feeding, how does that work to maybe reduce that or set that gut up?
Well, the first thing is trying to remember his name, Dr. Solabu. I can't remember his first name. A gentleman who did his PhD at Kansas State University. He did a beautiful study on creep feeding, and he really proved what most of us knew, which it isn't so much about the amount that we feed them, it's purely getting them familiar to some kind of feed and get some kind of stimulation of the amylase, maltase, some of the more regular carbohydrate type enzymes. and it really is in the last 2 or 3 days. I think there's really no point in creep feeding anything more than 3 days pre-weaning, and I think he showed that very, very well. But even just doing a little bit, a handful of feed on the mat in those 3 days pre-weaning can really be very, very beneficial, especially if they're using the same feed or at least the same smell and flavor that they're using for their N1 diet. The systems that we can get to do it, but there is a biosecurity risk there, do very well. But the challenge is obviously bringing bags of feed into sow farms, which is something today we want to try and avoid as part of biosecurity. And that's where we're actually, we're developing a gel technology to be a creep feed that we're going to be launching at the Iowa Pork Congress for this very subject. So it's a very powerful tool, but it has to be done correctly. And lots of pallets of bagged feed into a sow farm is not helpful.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I've had firsthand experience with trying to figure out how to bring those bags in safely. So, can you use these, fatty acids or monoglycerides into that creep feed? Does that help, or it's really just about getting those sugars and getting that different, substance of the intestine? Is it kind of the feed consistency, or is it what's in it?
I think it's just the idea of eating something, the sugars, but then the things that we can deliver effectively at those levels is going to be certain monoglycerides that act at very small milligram levels for immune modulation. It's never going to be high enough levels, for example, to have an antibacterial effect. We just cannot get high enough dosage into that pig. But even it has been proven in human research that very, very low levels of the monoglycerides, just like very, very low levels of omega-3s, can modulate the immune system. But then we can also deliver probiotics, for example, because probiotics can be delivered at very, very low levels, and we can deliver enzymes to help build up some basic carbohydrates enzymes as they reach the more corn-orientated feed.
Okay, so maybe a little bit of a guess about what might be in your gel product then, as you launch that going forward.
I can say monoglycerides and probiotics.
Right. Well, good. That's great. That helps me kind of link a little bit of the areas that I've had some field work with and your area of expertise. So I appreciate that. So let's talk about the success of getting that gut health in the nursery and kind of the profitability around that. So you've done a lot of work in modeling, right, and have experienced that. And I know, looking at some of the research on putting a water soluble product at the start of the nursery and trying to get that gut healthy, there is a cost to it. So, how do you weigh that cost and how do you measure that out in the field?
And I appreciate that question because I think the economic modeling is a very challenging one. And I think as we develop technologies to try and help producers, they have to be economically feasible and economically attractive. And I call those as two separate things. One is just simply viable, and the other one is that it gives a very nice return on investment. And ultimately, it's easier to think about this if we are a farrow to finish system, because what the investments we make in a lactation diet and in the first 3 weeks in the nursery is the easiest way that we can get high return on investment if we think about the overall system. One of the biggest challenges for me personally is when we look at programs, we typically look at that single phase, or maybe the nursery on its own. But I think there is much research from all of the major universities here in the US, like Kansas State, like Iowa State, like Illinois, that early performance does impact lifetime performance. And I need to say Purdue as well, because Alan Schinkel actually did a lot of the modeling work to even look at birth weight and weaning weight and all those things and how it carries all the way through. So when we think about economics, I think the fundamental thing is it has to be reasonable, which in real life terms, if it's something that's more than 50 cents a pig, unless it's one very, very well researched antibiotic, it's very hard to put that into a system and capture the level of ROI that would make everyone feel comfortable. But when we're looking at something that is, say, 25 cents a pig, and we could capture an extra 2 to 3 pounds body weight, or we can capture 500s in feed efficiency, then we're starting to have very nice, significant return on investment. And I think that's the model that we have approached. There are many attractive technologies on the market, but some of them just get too expensive. What we find is that we try and target areas. And we do have people that use monoglycerides in finishing pigs, specifically during influenza and purse breaks. But again, we have to do very short durations, which really water solubles is the only way to do that, because adding any of these kind of technologies into one entire finishing diet gets very expensive. We have some people that do it because they have very specific issues on a specific farm. Just like the E. coli situation we talked about earlier, that some farms just getting the bugs out of there seems to be very difficult. So that's a roundabout way of answering your question. The economics have to be feasible. That's the reality. But I think we really as an industry have to stop looking at whether it's a vaccine, whether it's an antibiotic, whether it's a feed additive, on one single phase. We have to look at the overall system, whatever that system is, whether it's farrow to wean, whether it's wean to finish, or whether it's farrow to finish. I think it's very critical for us as an industry.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. I think, looking at the whole process, right, because it's a systems approach, and just putting in one mitigation step for one specific disease for 7 days in the nursery and only evaluating that in, a small amount of groups doesn't give you the whole picture of the, the whole profitability. We worked with what are the parameters, right, to measure profitability in the system, or what are the key production indicators that we should be looking at trying to improve a system. And one of the things that we keyed in on is mortality, right? Mortality and morbidity. That's probably the key driver for whether a pig gets to market or not. If it's dead, it doesn't get there, right? And even a lightweight pig. So you mentioned, the 16-pound wean pig, but it's at that, in 1,000 pigs, you have a lot of those pigs that are, 10% that are less than, say, 13 pounds, right? And those are the ones that you have to bring in, is tightening that variation. So any ideas on how to tighten that variation, or maybe just feed those young pigs, or the small pigs, something different, or something different in the water? Have you seen any technologies that people are looking at in that area?
Yeah, so I think ultimately the philosophy we have as a company is to feed to the maximum genetic potential in the nursery, which I know is different to some of the industry because it's more expensive to do it that way. But ultimately, the really fast-growing pigs can only increase so much. So the more you squeeze everything together, the less variation you have coming out of the nursery. And you can even show it mathematically that the only way you can reduce variation is by pushing everything as close to its genetic potential as possible. Everything will move up, but the big guys can only move up so much within the realms of calorie and protein intake that they have at that phase. And that's the area that we have found the most success. And I think the monoglycerides are very critical from the perspective that they support feed intake for reducing inflammation. And I think that's something that we have found. There are technologies that do very nice in our research facilities. Then we take them out on farm and they're a bust. And that's just me being open about the wonders of research and development. But the monoglycerides is something that has very effectively been able to translate into the real farms. And I think one of the areas, especially for our water solubles, but also our feed supplements, is that we are able to support feed intake in a very significant way. And I think one of the largest drivers of variation, and I'm thinking of a recent experience we had at the research farm where we had influenza come in, because there's been quite a lot of influenza in the Midwest in the last 2 months. And right after it came in some PRRS, which is not ideal, but we were able to do some trials because of that were very interesting. But the reality is, you have those pigs in the group that don't really care and they just keep on doing their thing, and then we have these pigs over here that fall apart. And that's what causes the extreme variation, because you have some pigs that absolutely slow down and some that just keep on going. And I think that's where any technology that can maintain feed intake during challenges or reduce the duration of the peak drop in feed intake have a lot of power from tightening that variation when we get to slaughter time. And for me personally, that's one of the most powerful applications of some of these monoglycerides.
And as you mentioned, during a disease challenge like that, it's typically a short-lived disease challenge, but can have long-lasting effects. So perhaps, even if it is early finishing, using a mitigation tool for that specific short time frame through the water may be a good tool.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, so we're going to round out, our discussion, but you mentioned a little bit earlier, if you take anything home from this discussion, this is what it would be. Can you share, just a little bit of a summary with us before we close out?
Sure. I think from a personal level, I think number one is we cannot, as an industry, forget what happens in the first 48 hours post-weaning. And I think with multiple placements, staggered fills, doing that well is an art form. And I think that's an area that every single system, if it spent a little bit more time in that area, could gain huge benefits. The other piece is, when using monoglycerides effectively, or monoglyceride technologies effectively, they can add a lot to a system. Whether it's 1% wean to finish mortality or more, it's still very large returns. So the correct placement is very important, but I think we need to look for monoglycerides. They have been lumped into the feed mitigation area or the feed biosecurity area. And I think the first thing I would ask people to take home is what we do in the first 48 hours. The second thing is that these monoglycerides do an awful lot for the immune system. And what they do for the immune system is very, very powerful tool if we use it correctly.
Very good. So for our listeners today, if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave that. You can send that to us through the podcast, and or if you just want to give us a like because you enjoyed our discussion today, that would be very, very great as well.
It's time for our famous 3. Explore MetaFarms for all your livestock production data needs. Experience our integrated software platform offering complete operational visibility from breed to market. Utilize customizable dashboards for data analysis and benchmarking. MetaFarms mobile apps enable offline access, maximizing efficiency and enhancing profitability. Visit us today at MetaFarms.
So, Dr. Sandberg, we ask our guests a few questions at the end of our show to get to know them a little bit more, and just to understand a little bit about your perspective. So, one of those questions is, what's your favorite resource or book in your area of expertise that you like?
I'm going to sound like a real nerd now, but it's a quantitative biology of the pig. It's written by a man called, edited by a gentleman called Ilias Kyriazakis, who was my PhD supervisor. And it's a book that will even make a veterinarian like quantitative nutrition. So,
very good. Well, I can tell you I haven't looked at it, but I will. I'll take a look. So then on a kind of more personal side, what's your favorite resource or book outside of agriculture, outside of your area of expertise?
Yeah, I would say it's probably, I would have to give two answers there. One, I became a Christian when I was 35, so the Bible is a book that I use extensively, but even in work life, because it's history, it's wisdom, and spiritual things. But as a wisdom tool, I use it a lot in business because it has a lot of applications into life. But from a more general standpoint, Atomic Habits by James Clear is just a wonderful book. And his principle of changing a little bit every day and the compound effect that that gives you in growth. Um, it's very challenging to do, but it is an amazing book that I would recommend to anyone. So.
Oh, great. I will have to check it out. I have not checked that one out, so I will. So, as a professional, what are the key attribute or characteristic that you find sets a successful person apart from others?
Yeah, I think it's very much listening more than you talk. Um, I think a challenging, very challenging thing when you're a technical advisor of any kind, or if you're part of a team, is that we all like to be heard. But unfortunately, we were given two ears and one mouth, so we're supposed to listen twice as much as we talk. And I think being able to listen in a real way is something that was very hard for me as a very traditional scientist coming out of school, but learning how to listen well. Um, and I know many people in our industry who are much better than me at doing this, and they are typically those people we see as successful in our industry because they hear what people are trying to say.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. As I've grown in my career, I tend to be an extrovert, and so I sometimes don't listen enough. So I agree, and really intellectually listening. Really, what are they really asking for or saying? Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for being on our show. I've learned a lot about monoglycerides and their impact and feeding the pig and profitability. So I appreciate your time today. Please, if anybody has comments or questions, send those our way. And thank you for listening.
Thank you for the time.